appreciate very much you coming this morning and talk about a subject I've been talking about for a long time. A lot of people ask when and how did I get the title for the book, and I do tell a little bit about how that happened. I really didn't create the title. It came to us all naturally because it was during the campaign that on a college campus, I believe it was at Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, all of a sudden the students started chanting, and it was to my pleasant surprise, they kept saying, "End the Fed." So it was a spontaneous outburst, and it gave me the idea that maybe we could follow up with a book. But it to me is a very important subject because of the significance of it, and it's becoming more important all the time. Now, the book was written with the intent of explaining to my best ability the role of the Federal Reserve in our financial system. But there's a lot more to it than just that. The bottom line really becomes the nature of money itself. And the book is sort of in certain, broken down into certain groups. In certain parts. I start off by talking about when I first started thinking about money as a very young person. And I thought at the time that I had mixed feelings about talking about my personal experience, even as a small child, about my first job earning pennies and recognizing the value of the money and saving coins. Yet, and when I sent this to the publisher, I said that, maybe you want to strike that because at times their stories sound a little bit corny. But that was the part he really liked, and it turned out that a lot of other people liked to read a little bit about my early experience in money. And I tell many stories about that and the reflections that my grandmother had about the importance of money. She was from Germany, and she knew something about the runaway inflation of Germany and the significance of all this and the value of owning property. And this to me was very important, but it starts with the whole idea about a penny. And at that time, a penny was made out of copper, and although that is not the truly traditional monetary unit, it had been used as money a long time, but it never at that time approached anything of having an advantage to melt copper. Eventually, we inflated the currency where it was an advantage to melt, not use gold and not use silver. It'd be better to melt your silver than pay a bill with silver. But we have gone so far that it has become an advantage that the copper is worth more than one penny. Matter of fact, we went from copper to copper and zinc to just zinc, and we're at a point now where we can't even afford the zinc standard. And it's a pretty good story in understanding the importance of a commodity. But the ultimate story is to restrain the government from creating money out of thin air. In the book as well, I go over the history of the Federal Reserve. It's not the greatest in detail, and there's a lot more information about the reason they brought up the Fed and created the Fed. Of course, they came out of the crisis of 1907. But the real important history, which deserves a lot more attention than it gets in this book, and that is the argument always used about, we had to have the Fed because the gold standard always failed, and that's why we had the crisis in the 19th century. But the truth is all the monetary crises that we had throughout the 19th century, especially around the Civil War period, came because we didn't follow the gold standard, or local people inflated, or the banks inflated, or it happened within the states. It had nothing to do with really following the rules of the gold standard. But that history is important. And of course, there are quite a few textbooks written about how they got together and brought about the Federal Reserve at Jekyll Island. And that part of the story is, I think, very, very important to understand how this happened. I go through a section also as well about my experience with meeting the various Austrian economists, because that is what I have concentrated on. Frequently I'm asked, matter of fact, this very week, Joe Scarborough asked me, he says, he took a quote that I had made in the banking committee in the early part of this decade as saying, you know, we're going the wrong way. You have a bubble, we're going to have a crisis. And he was pushing. He says, well, how did you know this? And I said, well, I didn't exactly know it as much as I've read economics that are a lot better than the Keynesian economics. And that logic tells us that bubbles come and you can explain why they occur. But my exposure to the Austrian economists came with my first reading Hayek's book, A Road to Serfdom. And then from that I went on to study and read about books by Mises and Hayek and Murray Rothbard, and mentioning the personal associations, because I did hear Mises' lecture, one of his last lectures before he died. I had dinner once with Hayek, and that was a very important influence, just the fact that I read and studied and got to meet him, and then got to know Hans Sennholz, who was a teacher and ran the economics department at Grove City, as well as knowing and being friends with Leonard Reed at the Foundation for Economic Education, and then becoming close friends with Murray Rothbard, one of the students of Mises. So these personal associations reinforced all the things that I was inclined to believe anyway. This are more or less just the personal things that I mentioned in the book. But we have other reasons and other concerns that we should have about the whole monetary system. The other associations that I talk about in the book are the associations with the Federal Reserve Board chairman. And I've had a few of those. And matter of fact, just for a month or so, when I first went into Congress, Burns was still the chairman. I didn't really get to know him, and it was such a short period, and he was in poor health. But the one that I got to know the best in the early years was Paul Volcker. And I gave him a little bit of a plus as far as the various members, various chairmen that I've met, because he seemed to be more willing to discuss things on a one-to-one basis. And actually there was one time when we were working on the Monetary Control Act in the early 1980s, which gave a lot more power, regulatory powers, to the Federal Reserve and to monetize debt. And I was arguing one case in the committee that it was a dangerous thing because it could, the Federal Reserve was given too much power to inflate endlessly and didn't have to have any reserves whatsoever and could take interest rates down to zero or whatever. And he was disagreeing with me, and he says, look, he says, what I'd like you to do is come over and have breakfast with me. And that wouldn't happen with Bernanke or Greenspan. They didn't do that. So I did. I went over to the Federal Reserve and we had the discussion. He tried to, convince me differently. But I feel like I won the argument with him because as I was leaving, he says, yes, you may be right about this, but he himself, that I may be right on the interpretation of the legislation, but he himself would not inflate. He wants this so that he has the power to restrain monetary authorities rather than to expand monetary powers. But it turns out that, yes, I said, you might not want to use these powers to rapidly expand the money supply, but someday somebody else might want to do it. And of course I make the comment, I think that someday is right here when you see what Bernanke did, within a few months, doubling the monetary base. So that his authority was granted back at that time. And there was a time, the Federal Reserve was required to have gold behind the expansion of money, so they were restrained. And as bad as they were and inviting problems, they still had some restraint up until 1971. But even though the Federal Reserve Act gave the power to the Fed to buy corporate debt. They really never did that until just recently.